The voicemail came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter in our house in Lincoln Park, still in my robe, pouring coffee into a mug with a chip in the handle that I had been meaning to replace for 2 years. Nathan had already left. His side of the bed was cold. His coffee cup was in the sink, rinsed. He always rinsed it. And the house had that particular silence it gets when someone has been gone long enough for the air to settle back into place. The voicemail was from our accountant, Gerald Moss. 14 years we had used Gerald. He had a soft, careful voice, the kind that belongs to a man who understands that numbers carry weight. He said there were irregularities in our joint account he needed to discuss with both of us. He said he had tried to reach Nathan first. He said Nathan's number had been disconnected. I stood there, holding that chipped mug, and the first thing I felt was not panic. It was recognition, because I had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Not for those exact words, not from Gerald, not on a Tuesday morning, but for the moment when the thing I had been quietly watching would finally break the surface. I had known, in the way you know things you cannot yet prove, that whatever was wrong in my marriage was not only Nathan's doing. It was older than Nathan. It had a name, and the name was Elaine Hawthorne. My mother-in-law had been working against me from the week I married her son, and I had spent 3 years writing it all down in a yellow legal pad in the bottom drawer of my desk at work, saying nothing. Not because I was afraid. Because I understood, even then, that the most dangerous thing I could do to a woman like Elaine was to let her believe she was winning. If you have ever stood in a kitchen and felt the floor shift beneath you, stay with me. This story is for you. I said I had been writing things down for 3 years. What I had written, and what I did with it, is the reason this story ends the way it does. The Hawthornes were the kind of family that printed their Christmas cards in October. Elaine presided over every room she entered with a warmth so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine feeling. She remembered birthdays. She brought lemon pound cake to neighbors recovering from surgery. She volunteered at her church's food pantry every third Saturday, and she always made sure someone saw her do it. When Nathan brought me home for the first time, I was 28, just promoted to regional marketing director. Elaine took my hands in both of hers and said, "We have been waiting for you." She said it like a prayer, like a relief. I felt chosen. I felt seen. That was the first lie, designed precisely to make me feel I had arrived somewhere safe, so I would stop looking at the locks on the doors. If that warmth sounds familiar, the kind that makes you feel like you finally belong, you are not alone. The feeling was real. The welcome was not. The neighborhood loved Elaine. Our friends loved Elaine. At our wedding, 3 of my own bridesmaids said she was the most gracious woman they had ever met. She was gracious. She was also cold the moment no one was watching, territorial in ways that left no visible marks, and incapable of sharing the primary attachment in her son's life with anyone who might actually keep him. She loved Nathan the way a collector loves a rare piece, completely, possessively, and with no intention of releasing the lock. Their son had been raised to be polite, ambitious, and completely dependent on his mother's approval in ways he could not articulate, and I would not fully understand for years. Nathan was not a person in that dynamic. He was a possession. And I had just married into the collection. What I did not know yet was how far back Elaine's planning reached, and how long it would take for me to discover exactly what she had already set in motion before I ever walked through her front door. The first time I understood what I was dealing with, we had been married 8 months. Easter dinner, Elaine's house, the extended family filling every chair. I had made my grandmother's sweet potato dish, orange zest, toasted pecans, and Elaine set it at the far end of the table, between the extra bread basket and the dish no one touched, and spent the entire meal asking Nathan if he remembered the casserole she used to make when he was small. He did remember. He smiled the warm, softened smile he wore when she handed him his childhood. Nobody touched my dish. Then, after dinner, when the whole family gathered in the living room, Elaine stood at the center and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Nathan, sweetheart, you look thinner. Is she feeding you enough?" She laughed. Two of the aunts laughed. Nathan said, "Mom, we're fine." He did not look at me. There is a particular kind of humiliation that happens in public and leaves no fingerprints. If you have sat in a room, smiling, holding your plate, while someone dismantled you in front of people who laughed, you know exactly how much that costs. You did not imagine it. And you were not overreacting. I sat in that living room for the next 40 minutes with a plate in my hands and a smile I had learned to construct the way you construct a load-bearing wall. No one asked me a single question about myself. Elaine told a story about Nathan at 12, at 15, at 22, everyone beginning and ending with her at the center. Everyone told as though the 9 years I had spent with him were a footnote she had not yet decided to include. In the car home, I mentioned it. Lightly. Nathan said I was being sensitive. He said his mother liked me. And I thought, that is exactly what she told him to say. I did not bring it up again. But I opened that desk drawer when I got to work on Monday morning, and I wrote it down. The date, the words, the 22 minutes he left his own anniversary dinner to take her call 3 weeks later. All of it. That was the first time I understood that Nathan was not a passive figure in this marriage. He had been trained to protect Elaine from the people who noticed her clearly. With a passive husband, you can reason with him. With a trained one, every conversation you have about his mother is a conversation she has already prepared him for. The comments accumulated after Easter. Never direct, Elaine never said anything you could quote cleanly. She wondered aloud whether I seemed tired lately. She mentioned Nathan had been promoted faster before we met. She asked, whenever we talked about money or plans, whether we were sure. That was her word, sure. She used it the way a surgeon uses a blade, with precision, with calm, with no visible emotion. At our 3rd anniversary dinner, she called Nathan 4 times. The 4th time, he stepped outside. He was gone 22 minutes. We left before dessert. Hold that image. Because it was not the worst thing he would do. Hold that image. Because the pattern Elaine was building, dinner by dinner, phone call by phone call, was not just about control. It was about money, and what I would eventually find in Gerald Moss's office would prove it in numbers. I had a yellow legal pad in the bottom left drawer of my office desk, the office downtown, not the home office Nathan and I shared, because nothing in a shared space ever felt entirely mine. Behind a folder labeled Q3 Vendor Contracts, I wrote things down the way an analyst writes things, dates, exact words as closely as I could reconstruct them, who was present, dollar amounts when I had them. It started as a way to stay sane. To remind myself that what I noticed was real, that I was not constructing patterns from loneliness. Some mornings I would open that drawer and read 3 lines from 6 months earlier and feel something clarify in my chest. Not anger. Resolution. The kind that comes from knowing you were right and deciding, very quietly, that being right will eventually matter. The legal pad became the truest thing I owned. If you have ever kept a private record, a journal, a notes app, screenshots, because you needed something to hold on to that was yours alone, that instinct was protecting you. The third thing I ever wrote on that pad was the moment I realized Elaine had already started separating Nathan from me financially. He had mentioned, at dinner on a night I had thought was ordinary, that he had opened a secondary savings account for tax purposes. He said it casually, the practiced casualness of a sentence rehearsed until it sounds spontaneous. I said nothing. I watched his face. Later that night, after he was asleep, I drove to my office and wrote it down. The date, the restaurant, the exact words, the way his eyes moved slightly to the left when he said it. I did not know yet what it meant, but I knew it meant something. And the legal pad had room for everything I did not yet understand. Every entry on that pad was correct. Every single one. A secondary savings account opened quietly, his eyes moving slightly to the left. At the time, I did not know where that money was going. I would. And the number, when Gerald Moss finally showed it to me on paper, would not be small. In March of our 5th year, I was offered a promotion that does not come twice in a career. VP of Brand Strategy at a firm in New York. My mentor called it generational. The salary would have tripled. I told Nathan the night I got the call, good wine, good plates, my whole hopeful face arranged and ready. He went quiet, in a way I had not seen before. Not thoughtful quiet, the quiet of something closing down behind his eyes. He said he needed to think. He said it was a lot. He went to the bedroom and was on the phone with Elaine for an hour and 40 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the low register of his voice through the wall, the cadence of him agreeing, conceding, being redirected, and at one point I heard him say, "I know, Mom, I know. She doesn't understand what we'd be giving up. We." As if Elaine were the third partner in our marriage. An hour and 40 minutes on the phone with his mother. About your career. If you are somewhere right now recognizing that dynamic, the way a third person occupied what should have been your marriage, I want you to know that is not a small thing to carry. You were right to notice. When Nathan came back, he had a list of concerns. Timing. Stability. Their financial investments in Chicago. He used the word "there." He looked me in the eye and delivered his mother's argument in his own voice, with his own expressions, as though every conclusion were his own. He said things she had said, exact phrases, exact rhythms. And that was the moment I understood, with complete clarity, that Elaine did not just influence Nathan. She operated him. She had spent 40 years refining the mechanism, the guilt, the warmth withheld, and then restored, and by the time he sat across from me at that kitchen table, the mechanism was flawless. I did not fight for the promotion. I did not fight him. I went to work Monday morning, opened the sticky desk drawer, and added a new entry. Because I already knew what I was going to do. I just needed him to believe I didn't. I said I already knew what I was going to do. That decision, made quietly, at a sticky desk drawer, while the people who had taken everything thought they had finished, is exactly where this story turns. Keep watching. 2 weeks after I declined the New York position, Elaine invited us to dinner. Just us, she said. Martin was in Phoenix. She made Nathan's favorite, braised short ribs, the crusty bread she only made when she had decided an occasion mattered. Good china. She was softer that evening than I had ever seen her, softer than the holidays, softer than any version of herself I had witnessed in 5 years of marriage. She asked about my work without probing. She laughed at things I said. She poured my wine before Nathan's. And I smiled back, ate the short ribs, told her the bread was wonderful. But underneath all of it, some part of me was completely still. Because the first entry I had ever written on the legal pad 3 years earlier, before I understood what I was documenting. Read. Elaine is at her warmest when she has already won something. Elaine is at her warmest when she has already won something. Warmth can become dangerous when someone thinks they've already won. She had just won. I had declined New York. Nathan had stayed, and now she was celebrating by letting me sit at her table and feel comfortable. At the end of the meal, Nathan raised his glass and said, "To family." He looked at his mother when he said it. Not at me. I raised my glass. I smiled at Elaine, and for half a second, something behind her eyes went very still, like a machine that had finished its work and was waiting for the next assignment. In the car home, Nathan took my hand and said he thought his mother was coming around. He smiled in the dark, and I looked at him, this man I had loved, who had just toasted to family while looking at his mother, and felt something complete inside me. Not break. Complete. Like a decision that had been forming for years had finally finished forming. 3 days later, I called Gerald Moss. 3 days later, I called Gerald Moss, and what Gerald showed me, on paper, in black and white, across 38 months, would change everything that came next. I sat in Gerald's office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue and looked at the pages the way you look at something you already know is there. 14 months of transactions from the joint account and the secondary savings account Nathan had opened, he had told me, for tax purposes. The withdrawals were regular, not dramatic, nothing that would trigger an automatic alert. Between $800 and $2,200 every 6 to 8 weeks moved to an account I did not recognize. Over 38 months, the total was $61,400. Gerald watched me read with the stillness of a man paid to be discreet. When I asked whose account the transfers had gone to, he said he would need a court order to confirm, but that the routing number suggested a private personal account, not a business entity. I thanked him. I asked him to hold the records. A private personal account, not a business, not Nathan's. When Patricia confirmed whose name was on that account, the name I already suspected, I understood that what Elaine had done was not impulsive. It was a system, built over 3 years, with her own son as the instrument. Outside, Lake Michigan was flat and gray under a November sky. I walked 3 blocks and called my attorney, who had already begun a preliminary search while I sat in Gerald's office, because Patricia Osei did not wait for information to come to her. She told me what the routing number had confirmed. The account was not Nathan's. It was not a joint account. It was a private personal savings account, held in the name of Elaine Margaret Hawthorne. She had not just engineered my isolation from Nathan's decisions. She had been stealing from our marriage, methodically, patiently, across 3 years, using her own son as the transfer mechanism. And she had done all of it while pouring my wine first, while asking about my work, while smiling across the table at me with an expression I had briefly mistaken for tenderness. That was the last time I felt anything close to surprise about Elaine Hawthorne. $61,400. Taken while she poured your wine first. If you are watching this, and your body just went cold, trust that response. Your instincts were working the whole time. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't. The absence of fear after years of low-level dread felt like stepping into a room I had never been permitted to enter. I moved through the house in Lincoln Park like a woman completing a task. I went to work. I attended the Sunday dinners. I smiled at Elaine over wine glasses, asked about her garden, received her warmth like a gift I intended to return with interest. Underneath all of that, I was working. I transferred the legal pad's contents into a document Patricia could file. I cross-referenced every withdrawal date against Elaine's calendar, shared with Nathan since the year we married, and found 8 direct overlaps with days she had called him multiple times. I requested phone records. I contacted a forensic financial analyst. I was methodical. I was quiet. I was, for the first time in 5 years, entirely myself. That was the first time in 5 years I felt like myself again. They had trained me so thoroughly to manage my responses, to swallow observations, to perform steadiness in rooms where nothing was steady, that when I finally chose silence on purpose, as strategy, as weapon, it felt like getting my voice back. The last thing I wrote on the legal pad was not an observation. It was a date and 2 words. Today, Patricia. I closed the drawer. I left the folder labeled Q3 vendor contracts exactly where it had always been. I drove home. I made dinner. Nathan rinsed his cup and set it in the sink. I watched him, and I thought, he has no idea. And then, more quietly, she has no idea either. That was the last time I felt anything close to pity for either of them. She had no idea. And what Patricia Osei was about to walk into that courtroom carrying would make certain it was the last advantage Elaine Hawthorne ever had. Patricia Osei had an office in the Gold Coast with the kind of stillness that made you feel the room had been organized around her, not the other way around. She had handled 43 cases involving marital financial misconduct in 6 years. She was not impressed by drama or by the particular performance that women in difficult marriages sometimes feel they need to give in order to be believed. She looked at my documentation, the legal pad, the Gerald Moss records, the forensic analysis, the cross-reference timeline with 8 confirmed date overlaps, and was quiet for a long moment. Not reading. Thinking. Then she looked up and said, "This is meticulous." She said it the way you say something when you need the other person to understand that what they have done is real, that it is sufficient, that it will hold in a room designed to dismantle things. Then she said the sentence I had not known I needed to hear for 5 years. She said, "The fact that you documented instead of confronting is the reason this is going to work. You didn't react. You built." I had been managing my face in rooms for 5 years, at Easter dinners, in cars, at tables set with good china, while Elaine poured my wine first and smiled like she already knew the ending. I had swallowed observations. I had written things down instead of saying them out loud. I had performed patience so long, I had started to mistake it for surrender. And Patricia Osei, in that organized office, looked at a yellow legal pad full of dates and dollar amounts and told me I had built something. I did not cry, but something released in my chest that had been held so long I had stopped feeling its weight. Patricia closed the folder and said, "Let's talk about Elaine. You didn't react. You built. I need you to hear that. Whether you are in the middle of something like this, or past it, or just beginning to name it, you built. Writing it down is not weakness. It is construction." Patricia closed the folder and said, "Let's talk about Elaine." What came next, in a deposition room, under fluorescent lights, with a routing number and a forensic analyst's report, is where everything Elaine had built for 30 years would meet what I had built in 3. The divorce petition was filed in January. Discovery began within 2 weeks. Patricia introduced the forensic financial analysis into the record, $61,400 in systematic withdrawals from our joint marital assets, transferred over 38 months to a private personal savings account held in the name of Elaine Margaret Hawthorne, not Nathan's account, Elaine's. On deposition, Nathan stated that his mother had suggested the transfers as a private savings mechanism, a way to protect family assets in the event of a divorce. He said he had understood this to be standard financial planning. He said he had not told me because his mother had advised it was better kept between them. He said those words, better kept between them, without flinching, without looking at me. And in that small, fluorescent deposition room, I understood something I had been circling for years. Nathan had not been passively enmeshed. He had made choices. He had simply called them loyalty. Across the table, his attorney was doing the math in real time. I could see it in the small change around his eyes, the recalculation that happens when poor judgment becomes potential fraud, when liability shifts from a husband's choices to a mother-in-law's deliberate action. The therapist who had treated Nathan for anxiety, subpoenaed, testified that Nathan had disclosed in session that his primary conflict was between his mother's expectations and his marriage, and that he had consistently deferred to her guidance on financial and personal matters. She described a pattern she called enmeshed dependency with financial compliance. Nathan's face, when those words were read back into the record, was very still. Elaine sat in the gallery. I looked at her, briefly, deliberately, and I thought about the Easter dinner, the table arrangement, and every time she had quietly asked me whether I was sure about something. She had always been sure. She just had not expected me to be too. She had always been sure. She just had not expected me to be too. That line belongs to every woman who was underestimated. Every woman who was called sensitive, difficult, or ungrateful, while she was, quietly, building a case. I moved into an apartment in Wicker Park in February. Second floor, east-facing windows, morning light that came across the hardwood floors like something slow and deliberate. A bedroom that was only mine. A closet that held only my things. A kitchen with one coffee mug, unchipped, that I had bought for myself the week I signed the lease. The settlement was finalized in March. A civil suit was filed against Elaine Hawthorne for conversion of marital assets, and the $61,400 plus applicable interest, totaling $68,240, was ordered returned to the marital estate prior to division. Elaine paid in 2 installments. My share of the recovered funds became the down payment on a life I had chosen for myself, in a city I had always wanted, doing work I had spent 5 years watching recede in a rearview mirror I had not been allowed to turn around. My first morning in that apartment, I dropped a glass in the kitchen. It shattered across the tile in a clean, bright scatter. I stood there and waited for the voice, the held breath, the particular tension that lives in a house where breaking something carries consequences beyond the broken thing. There was nothing. Just the quiet of a space that belonged only to me, and the sound of glass on tile, and early light coming through east-facing windows. I swept it up. I made coffee in the unchipped mug. I stood at the window and watched the street below wake up, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be a person in your own life. Not a guest, not a performance. A person, in her own kitchen, who dropped a glass and nobody raised their voice. A person, in her own kitchen, who dropped a glass and nobody raised their voice. That quiet is what freedom sounds like. But the story was not finished. 2 years later, Nathan called. And then, 3 weeks after that, something arrived in the mail that I had not expected. From Elaine. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I took a position at a firm in New York. Not the exact role I had been offered in our 5th year. That window had closed. It wasn't the same opportunity. But it was mine. But something close enough to feel like the version where I arrived anyway, just by a longer road. A good apartment in Brooklyn with a view of the bridge. A team I respected. Work I found genuinely worth doing. friends who knew the whole story. The legal pad, the civil suit, the $68,000, the Easter dinner, the anniversary dinner we left before dessert, and loved me the way people love someone who came through something intact. 14 months after I moved to New York, Nathan called. He said his mother was ill. He said he had been in therapy. He said some things, not the words sorry, but the architecture of one. The careful language of a man who has finally looked directly at what he did. He asked if I had anything to say. I was standing at my window in Brooklyn, watching the lights of the bridge, and what I felt was not anger, not satisfaction, not the vindication I had once imagined. What I felt was distance. The clean, earned distance of someone who has done the work, closed the account, and moved on to something real. I told Nathan I hoped his mother recovered. I told him I was glad he was in therapy. I told him I wished him well, and I meant it, in the way you can wish someone well when their hold on you is finally and completely gone, when they have become someone who used to matter, which is not the same as someone who never did. When they have become someone who used to matter, which is not the same as someone who never did. That distinction is hard won. It takes years, but it is possible. And it is what the other side of this looks like. 3 weeks after Nathan's call, a card arrived. Paper, handwritten, delivered through Nathan to my mother's address in Cleveland, which Elaine had apparently kept on file since the year I married her son. The handwriting was careful and slanted. The handwriting of a woman who understood that how you present a thing matters as much as the thing itself. She wrote that she had been reflecting. That she hoped I understood she had only ever wanted what was best for Nathan. That perhaps she had not always gone about it the right way. That she hoped, in time, I might find it in my heart. There was no apology in that letter. The word sorry did not appear, not once, across 3 careful paragraphs of slanted, deliberate handwriting. What appeared instead, in the architecture of every sentence, was the same implication that had always been there, that my response to her actions was the problem, not the actions themselves, my response. I wrote back, 1 paragraph. I told her that the kindest thing I could offer was to leave her with the legal record, rather than my opinion of it. I told her that every document Patricia had filed was a matter of public record, and that her community, the neighbors who received her lemon pound cake, the church volunteers, the people who had watched her be gracious for 30 years, were welcome to read it. I sealed the envelope and mailed it. I never heard from her again. But through people who still lived in that world, I heard that the community did find the records, that the image Elaine Hawthorne had spent 30 years constructing did not survive contact with a forensic financial analysis and a therapist's deposition transcript. The garden still won its award that year, but the woman tending it was no longer who she had claimed to be. No anger, just the public record and the quiet confidence of a woman who had already said everything that needed to be said, in a courtroom, with documentation. That is not revenge. That is consequence. I still have the legal pad. Not in a file box, not in evidence storage. Patricia returned it to me after the civil case closed. It lives in the bottom drawer of my desk in Brooklyn, behind a folder labeled reference. I do not read it anymore. I do not need to. But I keep it because it represents something I could not have named in the early years of that marriage, something I only understand now in the particular quiet of a life I chose, the decision to stay awake. To notice. To write things down in the order they happened, instead of performing the version of fine that keeps the peace and costs everything else. I am 41. I live in a city I chose. I wake up every morning in a bed that belongs to me, and I feel, before I feel anything else, the absence of weight. The weight of a life managed for someone else's comfort, built around someone else's approval. The things that stay with me are not the betrayals. They are the Tuesday mornings at the desk with the sticky drawer, reading back what I had written and feeling something clarify in my chest. The patience it took to let evidence accumulate instead of letting anger lead. The moment Patricia Osei looked across her desk and said, "You built. Nathan has a new relationship. I wish him well, and I mean it. The way you mean things that no longer cost you anything to say." Elaine Hawthorne, last I heard, had recovered from her illness. I think about her less than you would expect, which is itself a form of justice, the quiet, undramatic kind that lives not in a courtroom, but in the simple fact that she no longer occupies any room in my mind I have not given her permission to enter. I built a life. She built an image. Only one of those things is still standing. You built. Whether you are at the beginning of that, or in the middle, or looking back from the other side, the fact that you are paying attention, that you are noticing, that you are staying awake in a situation designed to make you doubt yourself, that is construction. You are building something. If stories about women who paid attention, stayed quiet, and reclaimed their lives speak to you, subscribe. Share, comment, turn on notifications. I will see you in the next one.